Hi everyone, welcome back. This is part 2 of the nginx Ingress controller with AKS. This video is deep dive on running validations at various points in the cluster. Let's do a quick recap of where we left off in the previous video. So in the previous video, we had a 3-node AKS cluster deployed with a CNI overlay as the network plugin. And again, just to recap, the pod network and the node network are different with the CNI overlay. Then we deployed the nginx ingress controller, the in-cluster ingress controller, which has the layer 7 intelligence, as you know. And then we deployed these services, red, green, and blue, and those services were exposed at the cluster IP level. And then we tested the inbound flows. And just one more thing to recap here, the nginx service is deployed of the type LB. So it's exposed as a public IP on the Azure external load balancer, and then single public IP. With single public IP, we could do routing based on the host headers. So then we deployed, of course, the cluster IP services, and then we reviewed the inbound flows. So inbound flow from the perspective of this user, as you can see, the yellow circles show the various paths that it takes, and that's where we will run all the validations today. So a quick show of what Ingress brings to the table. We could do virtual host based routing. So we could do AKS red, green, and blue .domainname.com. That's the virtual host. And then we did fan out where you could do /red, /green, and /blue. Okay, so that's the inbound path shown in this yellow circles. And then we did outbound. Of course, outbound goes through the load balancer. There are other videos showing outbound with Azure Firewall and Net Gateway, but in this particular video, we're using the Azure load balancer as default outbound. All right, so that's the high level of what we did so far. And I want to show you one more thing about this DNS CNAME records that we set up for the AKS red, green, and blue and for this. So let me show that to you and in my DNS. So here here I am on the Kubernetes Kubernetes resource group. So let's pick the IP that's used for the inbound service. So this is the inbound service, and the way that you can find that out is if you go in um, if you go in let's start at the resource group. So let's go to the load balancer. And then if you look at the settings and front end IP, you have two IPs. So the way to find out which one is the internal is we just go in the load balancing rule and we pick out the internal, the .245. So going back to the resource group, let's go to the public IP, the .245, and I want to show you how I've created a DNS label and an AKS ingress. That's the DNS label, and in my DNS zone, I'm mapping AKS red, green, and blue to that same DNS label that we created. So end to end, this should work with CNAME just like how you would do it in production. So let's jump back into VS Code. So with VS Code, remember that 245 IP, the inbound IP, we tested all of this. So let's do a quick test one more time and make sure everything works. So here, I'm just going to cycle through all of these different, I'm going to cycle through these commands. So red, green, and blue. Okay, so that works with this fan out mode. Um, with the /red, green, and blue, and then we'll test it with the virtual host mode. Okay, so all of this works. Now let's go and also check with our FQDN real quick. So red, um, oops, let me just make sure here we have a typo. AKS, oops, AKS colors. So red, green, and blue. So this is with FQDN and also using the slash red, green, and blue, and this is using the virtual host. So we can directly call the host using the host name, and it all works well. So now we are getting into the part where we're running validations from within the cluster. And what does that mean? So let me first show you a visual of that. So going back to the drawing board, let me turn off the inbound flows and the cluster IP. So here what we will do is when we run the validations, we will run it from the perspective of this VM. So first set of validations, we'll run it from the perspective of this VM. So what that means is, let's light up this layer. So from this VM, we will connect to the node port. So node port. So that's the first set of validations. And then the second set of validation we will run from the perspective of this orange pod. I called it the troubleshooting pod, the T-shoot pod. And from there, we will connect first to the nginx cluster IP. Then we will connect to the blue service cluster IP, and then finally we will connect to the actual blue pod itself. So as you can see, there's various levels of abstraction. So we'll test at each and every part of the network. So let's go back to, so first we'll test it from the perspective of this VM. So going back here, so let's get the node port and the node IP first. So let me clear the screen. So we'll get the nodes and we'll get the node IP. Remember, this is that app routing system for the nginx Ingress controller. So the node port that we got here, so node IPs is the output of this kget node command, so 4, 5, and 6. And the node port is from the output of the second command, and we're going to pick this 31096. So that's the 31096. Okay, so what we will do is we'll SSH into that VM. So I'm already SSH'd into that VM. So let me just show you that. And from that, we'll hit each of the nodes. So we got the first one, we got this, and now remember we hit this glitch in the previous session where we couldn't connect to the node port on the other two nodes. We could only connect it to one of the nodes colon node port. Now why is that? So a full shout out to my colleague Jose Moreno here to help me out with understanding this a little bit more deeply. So let's take a look at this, and thank you, Jose, for helping me through this. So as you can see that the nginx pods are deployed only on the first nodes, 0, 0. So it is only answering on 4, which is 0, 0. So as you could see, going back again, only answering on 4. Now, if you, the reason that it is behaving this way, I expected it to listen on all of the nodes. Now, the reason it is behaving this way is because if we do a kget service, let's edit this service using this, and I'll show you exactly where that configuration is, and we'll change that default behavior. So there is a policy called external traffic policy, which is by default set to local, but if we set it to cluster, each of the nodes will listen on node IP colon node port. And I also want to show you this behavior on the load balancer before making the change. Let's go back, let's jump back and on the load balancer. And here you can see as well, I'm in the load balancer. I'm running a metrics on the health probe status for the front end IP of 245, and you can see that only one node is 100%. The other two are 0, 0. That means they're not answering on the node port. So let's go ahead and change that behavior. So we'll do a kget edit here, and we'll look for the external, and we'll look for external. And notice how this external policy is local. So we'll change that to cluster. And when we do that, we can now run the test from the VM again and see if it looks any better. So that worked before, and that worked before, and then now we have the 5 is working, and then the 6 is working. So let me clear the screen one more time. Let's test it again. So now all the 3 nodes are working. Beautiful. Again, thank you, Jose, for helping me understand this better. And so let's go check on the load balancer as well. And let's refresh this to see if this is looking any better. This may take a few seconds, so we'll come back and revisit this, but clearly it is working from that Azure, another VM that is above the nodes, that's outside of the clusters. So now that we did that test, let's test everything from the pods perspective. So going back again here in the visual, we just validated this 3 pink flows. And the moment we changed the policy to be of the type cluster, each of the nodes was answering. So now let's go jump onto this pod and we'll run these 3 validations. Okay, so first to the nginx cluster IP, then to the blue service, and then to the pod. So jumping back here, let's clear the screen. So first we will get the like the cluster IP for the nginx service. So as you could see, this cluster IP here is 125. So let's run it, and we'll do everything against the blue service. So that's the 125 here. So let's do that test. Oops, we need to exec into the pod. So let's exec into the pod first. So you could see that I am in that network troubleshooting pod. It has a pod IP of 10.244.2.114. So now let's run the test against the cluster IP of the nginx service. So that works, and that one works as well. Okay, so now let's exit out of the pod. We will get the cluster IP of the blue service. So we'll do this, and as you can see, the blue service IP is 140.185, which is this one. So I've staged the commands. So let's exec into the pod again, and we'll run an IP adder just to make sure we are in the pod, and then let's run against the blue service cluster IP. So that works as well. And then the last test we do is we'll get the pods, the actual pods. Let's clear the screen. And we'll pick one of the blue pods. So we're going to pick this one, the 1.42, and then we'll run the test against that. So let's exec into the pod. This is the network troubleshooting pod, and then we'll run the curl against the blue pod, and there. Now the blue pod works as well. So we ran tests again sitting on the network troubleshooting pod, and we ran the test all against all of these pink lines. So if something is not working, you can kind of deep dive at various levels to understand where things are not working. And now I have one more little bonus section on how do you actually, again, it is not recommended to get into the nodes, but should you need to troubleshoot in your lab environment, I have exec into one of the nodes, and as you can see, this is one of my nodes in the 172.16 236 dot 4. So I'm SSH'd into one of the nodes, and we can do quite a few things over here. And I'd like to show you a quick review of how some of the IP table settings are done. So you can look at this command IP tables save. There is a lot going happening over here, but should you need to deep dive over there, this is the command that you can follow, and it kind of jumps into different um, firewall rules and different chains. So you could do that. And then another interesting thing that I want to show you is that we could, it's an interesting point. I ran into this with a customer. And if you see this, let's go back into the load balancer, inbound rules. The inbound rule for the load balancer is a set with the floating IP enabled. So in theory, all of the packets will hit the node with the public IP of 245. So let's do a quick TCP dump to validate that. So what we'll do is we'll jump onto the node, and we will run a quick test here. So we'll do TCP dump and let's just do dash n dash ni80 host, and then we'll grab for this. Oops, we'll grab for this host. And we'll grab for this, we'll just run a capture for this host. And when we run another test from outside, you'll see that because by the virtue of that floating IP, so let's do a quick test with something from outside. I think we can just do this one. And jump back on the AKS node, and we'll control C out of it. And you can see that the node is actually getting the traffic with the destination of 245. And that is by the virtue of that floating IP. All right, so that's much more deep dive into some of the things you can do at the node level. And the same thing, let's validate some of the IP tables rules over here for that load balancer IP. And let's run that. Yeah, so this, we may not be able to get the load balancer IP exactly over here, but you could run a lot of the IP tables commands over here, the save command. And let's try that one more time with the save command. IP table save gives a lot more information there. So that's where you could see that that's the load balancer's public IP. Perfect. So now let's just make sure that one last check that our load balancer is looking healthier, that our probes there we have 100% on all of the three, going to all of the three nodes, and that is by the virtue of us changing that policy. And so now the node IP colon node port is listening on all of the three nodes. That um, that's it for today. Thank you again for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this session. Drop me a note, a comment. Let me know if you'd like to see anything else from a deep dive perspective. And I will see you in the next video.